And for the economic growth, I think that is very important to follow the competitive advantages of their economy and to have access to the large market for their products. And in this kind of multipolar worlds, certainly there's some tension there, but fundamentally it's very important for Colombia and other emerging market economy to get access to technology, to get access to the market, no matter what kind of global order it is.
So IEA has launched a new initiative called IEA Women in Leadership in Economics, that is looking at gender gaps in the field of economics in the global south. So it's a 5-plank, multi-year, multi-country project, and we are very excited about it.
Third nations, the nations that are not the great powers in the world, have benefited hugely from the kind of globalization and the American-led rules-based order that the world has gotten to enjoy for the last 7 decades. The reason we're talking now about what third nations can do is that that system is under threat. That system will probably no longer work, will no longer function for anyone. So what third nations need to do is to work out how they can be influential in changing the new order that will be emerging.
Bueno, en nuestro reporte mostramos que la desigualdad en América Latina no solamente es muy alta, persistente en el tiempo, sino que esta se transmite de generación en generación. Así que creo que el reporte abre una agenda de investigación muy rica en nuestra región para seguir entendiendo mucho de lo que ya sabemos sobre la apertura de brechas socioeconómicas en la formación de capital humano, pero mucho de lo que todavía necesitamos saber en términos de qué pasa después en el mundo laboral y en las oportunidades que tienen las personas de ahorrar y de acumular riqueza.
I think if Colombia and a developing country, certainly they need to look what is the best for their economic growth. And for the economic growth, I think that is very important to follow the competitive advantages of their economy and to have access to the large market for their products. And in this kind of multipolar worlds, certainly there's some tension there, but fundamentally it's very important for Colombia and other emerging market economy to get access to technology, to get access to the market, no matter what kind of global order it is.
So IEA has launched a new initiative called IEA Women in Leadership in Economics, that is looking at gender gaps in the field of economics in the global south. So it's a 5-plank, multi-year, multi-country project, and we are very excited about it.
to introduce Eduardo Engel to you. I'm really happy to be doing so. I've known Eduardo for many years. In my mind, I always thought of him as a macroeconomist, but when I look at his amazing productivity over all these years, I see that he never stopped thinking about infrastructure and the many challenges that it presents everywhere. Eduardo has a PhD both in statistics and economics, and perhaps not surprising, given his interests, prior to both of these, he had studied engineering in Chile. He's been a professor at various institutions. The longest prior to the Universidad de Chile, where he is now, is at Yale. He published in all the leading economic journals. He served as president of LACEA, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Economic Association. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, and in 2002, he was awarded its Frisch Medal. Now, corruption and infrastructure seem to be two topics that are intertwined. Given that Eduardo was going to be talking on this subject, and given my relative ignorance of it, I did a very quick Google search on the topic to try to educate myself a little bit before this. And the first thing that popped up was the Odebrecht case, which I think Eduardo is going to talk about later. And this is a Brazilian engineering and construction company that by 2009 was the largest in Latin America and within the top 20 in the world. This case, if you recall, it was covered by all the journals, all the periodicals everywhere, had Odebrecht bribing officials in 10 Latin American countries and some African countries as well, and ended up implicating about a third of the Brazilian senators and close to half of its governors. It was described by the US Department of Justice as the largest foreign bribery case. Now, obviously corruption in infrastructure has negative consequences for a variety of reasons, from not, doing a project in its not giving a project to the most efficient firm, to increasing public costs and hurting taxpayers, to destroying confidence in government and in the rules of the game, that they're applied fairly to everyone. So the questions that arise in this area is, how can we improve transparency? How can we regulate auctions better? How can we guard against cost padding once contracts are renegotiated? These are among the many, many important questions that are asked in this area. Eduardo is a world expert on this topic. He chaired a presidential anti-corruption commission in Chile in 2015. And I was not surprised to see that Eduardo has numerous times been awarded the Graduate Teacher of the Year at the University of Chile. He is a clear, lucid expositor of complex issues, and I really look forward to, as I'm sure you do as well, to learning about this important policy question from him today. So without further ado, Eduardo. And Eduardo, we're going to have questions afterwards, so if you can leave a bit of time.
Thanks a lot, Raquel, for that introduction and wonderful summary of what I'm going to say. Is that working? So, if you look at opinion polls all over Latin America, when people are asked about the topics that concern them the most, corruption shows up in the very top 3 most of the time and in most countries. And it's definitely part of the reasons why democracies are not working, why people distance themselves from democracies, why they end up electing populist leaders. So what I want to do here is not solve all the problems of Latin America. I have no solution for many of them, but simply tell you what you can do when you start looking more carefully at the data and thinking about policies that can help you deal with infrastructure and corruption. This is joint work with Nicolas Campos, Ronald Fisher, and Alexander Galetovich, and there's the list of some of the papers on which it is based. Let's start with some questions. Raquel has done a great introduction, but I'm going to repeat some of the stuff she said nonetheless. Corruption can show up at different stages for large infrastructure projects. At the first stage, which is the stage of selection and planning, you can have corruption, the payment of bribes, to select a project which is not that important for society, but which leads to large rents or favors some interest group. You can have also bribes being paid when you underestimate the cost of a project or overestimate the benefits to get it passed and approved by Congress so you can spend the money. And you can also have poor design of a project. This may be simply incompetence, lack of capacities in the state, but may also be intentional, as we will discuss a bit later. Then comes the tendering stage, at which you have a competitive auction and you select a firm to build this large infrastructure project. You can have a tailored auction where one of the firms paid bribes to have some requirements in the auction which favor itself at the expense of its potential competitors. You can also have that confidential information is leaked to some of the firms, those who pay bribes. And finally, you have the post-tender stage, which is relatively short for traditional provision, where you have 1 or 2 years or 3 or 4 years till you build the project, but can be 20 or 30 years for public-private partnerships, concessions, where often the main source of income for the firm will be the tolls it charges, for example, for a highway. During the post-tender, you can have extortion, where firms must pay money if they want to be able to build the project at all. But you can also have contract renegotiations, and there you may end up having that the firm that won the initial contract is not the firm that was most efficient and therefore could have the most attractive bid, but the firm that expected to be able to renegotiate the most. That is, the firm that was prepared to pay the largest amount of bribes, for example. This is sort of going on and off. So one question then is, what do we know about the magnitude of bribes? And the IMF is usually not in the business of corruption. If anything, that should be the World Bank or its regional partners, IDB and the like. Still, in 2016, the IMF, I think for the first time, published reports on the topic of corruption, motivated, interestingly, by the case of Ukraine. Essentially, there was IMF conditionality in loans to Ukraine, conditional on removing some corrupt officials in government. The IMF came up with this number, which is very much quoted by the press and in sort of the media, and which is that the amount of bribes paid worldwide amounts to approximately 2% of GDP. That's a lot because you're having all the bribes in the world there. So the denominator is just all of GDP. It's a very large denominator and it's a large number. How did they come up with this number? Essentially, there was a survey by the World Economic Forum in 2004 where they asked firms in 100 countries whether firms in their sector usually paid bribes, and if so, gave them a couple of ranges of what fraction of their income was paid in bribes. So this is an interesting number, but definitely not an estimate you should be taken very seriously. You go with other numbers, now in the infrastructure sector specifically, not bribes in general, and the numbers are much larger. Between 5 and 30% of costs, supposedly, based on these studies, are coming from, are destinated to bribes. That's huge numbers, and many of the estimates are between 20 and 30%. That raises the question, are these numbers trustworthy? Or if not, which are the numbers? Can we obtain numbers which have some standard deviation around them and some idea of their precision? And then, of course, related to the previous slide, all these bribes, at what stage are they paid? Is it at the planning stage? Is it later at the tendering stage? Or is it at the post-tender stage? All the questions we would like to answer. The second big question is the social cost of corruption. Qualitatively, again, it's the list which already Raquel introduced to you. You have delays and overcosts. You have projects with low social costs, therefore, and then you have basically that corruption scandals weaken democracies and lead to populist leaders. But at the quantitative level, things get more complicated. You have some very specific studies which are great. Great papers. My favorite is Ben Olkes and JPE, where you take, for example, in Indonesia, small projects, an RCT, you send to half of the small villages a credible threat that you're going to be audited with probability 1. If not, the probability is close to 0. You see what differences emerge. But the more general it gets less good. Let me give you one example. I remember a couple of years ago in a leading journal, I'm reading it as I received the email, and it says, here's a paper in the title which promises to look at the impact of corruption in the transportation sector in all of Europe. And I said, wow, I didn't even know about someone having written this. This is great. Someone finally did it. I would like to know the data. And you start reading the abstract, page 2, 3, 4, 5, and only on page 6, they tell you that their definition of corruption, their working definition of corruption is tenders with only one bidder. There are many reasons why you can have one bidder in a tender, and of course one of them is that there's some corruption going on, but there are many other reasons too. So I'm not sure if the editor read onto page 6 or what happened, but definitely that is not a major improvement in our understanding of what's happening with corruption. So we get to the Odebrecht case. Raquel went through part of this already. Odebrecht was this big Brazilian company which between 2005 and 2009 multiplied by 5 its sales. It became the largest one in Latin America and number 18 worldwide. It was also very well respected on technical grounds. So it obtained the prize from this European Business School as the best family company. It was family-owned in the world. When the corruption case appears, it was part but different from Lavallato or Petrobras. Raquel gave you some of these numbers already. Let me add one only at the level of presidents. It involved many presidents. One of them went to jail, which is the case of Lula. Another one was on the run. He's now in Peru facing trial, which is Toledo. He spent a long time on the run in the US, in fact. Another one resigned, Kuczynski. Another one committed suicide when the police came to put him into prison. Odebrecht, on 2 counts, is the largest corruption case ever prosecuted by the US Department of Justice. The US has a very pioneering anti-corruption law, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, passed in 1978, which means that US officials that pay bribes outside of the US will be treated as if they had paid it in the US. To give an example, in Germany until 2000, it was legal to pay bribes abroad and you could discount it from your cost for tax purposes. So this is quite a difference. Look at the 3 columns there. You have the 10 largest cases. The next slide has the remaining 5. Ever prosecuted by the DOJ under the FCPA. And you have, for example, that the first column, which is gross profits from bribes. So when you go to DOJ for a plea bargain, you sit down with a lot of experts and must provide careful evidence, not only on all the bribes you paid and to whom you paid them, but also a calculation of how much money you made thanks to those bribes, okay? Odebrecht by itself has $3.3 billion. You add up cases 2 through 10, and it's approximately a bit less than that. So Odebrecht by itself made more money from bribes than the case 2 through 10 prosecuted by FCPA. It paid $800 million in bribes, and it was fined, the number you see at the right there, a little over $3 billion as well. Here are the remaining cases to make number 10. The impact was economic. All these cases, when you are a macroeconomist, or my friends who are only macroeconomists always say, well, but this is sort of irrelevant. Well, even the IMF said that Peru and Brazil grew 1 or 2 points less because of the direct impact of the Odebrecht case. A number of projects were stopped in the middle. Many firms went bankrupt, which had nothing to do with Odebrecht at all, but they were intermediaries, and it showed up on macro numbers, and there you have one of many statements from a political scientist about the impact this had on the emergence of populist leaders. The data then. Since you have all these rich data sets with plea bargains, that's a starting point to do some research. And we have more than 100 plea bargains. Important among them is the Department of Justice, but it's not the only one. There are others in all of Latin America and some European countries as well. We looked at those. We looked at investigative reporting, some of it really excellent, and official sources as well. So for example, bribes paid, Google, DOJ, Odebrecht, and we'll see the plea agreement. There are more details which are not in the official document, but there are enough details there to tell you how much $1 million Odebrecht paid in every one of the 12 countries where it paid bribes. Profits from bribes, I already told you, also from the DOJ. The initial cost estimate and the final cost after renegotiations of the contracts come from official sources in every country. And then the quid pro quo, what you were buying with bribes of that long list I gave you at the beginning, we obtained from judicial documents and also from media sources, and did a lot of web scraping in the process. What projects do we look at? The main numbers I'm going to report come from all the projects Odebrecht did in Latin America's 8 countries during the period investigated by the DOJ. This is approximately a decade. It varies from country to country, but approximately between 2005 and 2015. So this is a census, there's no selection. We left out 2 countries in Latin America. One is Venezuela, because even though Odebrecht had all the incentives to come up with the data, they convinced the DOJ that not even they did know the data of what was going on in Venezuela. And the other case is Brazil, which has too many projects. So as a robustness check, we looked at 105 projects in Brazil for which we could get the data, and the results I'm going to give you remain qualitatively similar for Brazil as well. Out of the 88 projects, 59 are the standard public provision of infrastructure, and 29 are public-private partnerships. There's no important difference between both in the statistics, so I only mention this now. Here's sort of a first summary of what we have in the data. Look at Argentina. The period investigated by the DOJ in Argentina goes from 2007 to 2014. Bribe payments, $35 million. Gross profits from those bribes, $278 million, so that was pretty remarkable. For every dollar you paid, you obtained like $7 or $8. 6 projects done by Odebrecht, evidence of bribes in 5 projects, and then you have $4 billion initial cost of those projects and over $13 billion the actual final cost of these projects. Let me give some examples, 2 concrete projects, one from Colombia, where we are right now. The Ruta del Sol, it's a 500-kilometer highway going from Puerto Salgar to San Roque. And the evidence we have from legal documents in the US and in Colombia is the following one. At the auction level, it was a tailored auction. Basically, Odebrecht paid bribes to a vice minister to obtain 3 requirements which essentially left out all of its competitors. Okay? Now, it won. Now, thank God there was the maximum bid you could have, so they did not win as much as they would have liked, but they won the contract. But then comes a post-tender renegotiation. And this is an extreme example of something that happens a lot. They were supposed to build 1 highway. They ended up building 2 highways. And it's a full new separate highway they built as well as part of this contract and in a contract renegotiation. What is the difference? For the second highway, there was not even an intent to have a competitive auction. It was just a negotiation between partly corrupt officials and the Odebrecht company. Despite the fact that someone asked officially the National Controller of Colombia, where it was legal to add a second highway as part of a contract of the first highway, and the controller said, no, it's not legal. Okay? They did it nonetheless. So this is a major renegotiation. You just add a new project in non-competitive circumstances. Add to that the original contract was renegotiated an additional 10 times. Toll plazas were increased, which means you collect more for the same traffic. And on top of that, tolls were increased by 15% beyond the initial contract. Second example from Peru. This is the second stretch of the IRSA, which is an intercontinental highway, big project, politically motivated. It was very clear that there was not demand that justified this. But the interesting part here is the following one. Through a close associate, President Toledo contacted Odebrecht and basically negotiated a bribe for performance agreement. So it was not a fixed amount, but how much he would receive depended on what he provided. The idea was that he would influence Proinversión, the regulator in Peru that is in charge of these contracts. Now, Odebrecht was interested in 2 things. One, no competition, as most companies would love. But second, they wanted also to increase the cost estimate. because you were not allowed under Peruvian law to bid more than 10% above the cost estimate. So for some interesting reason, Toledo delivered on number 1. The conditions were created and you had only one bidder and Odebrecht won. But on number 2, he was not able to deliver. So instead of $35 million, he only received $20 million as a bribe payment, okay? Post-tender, again, the project was renegotiated 8 times and the cost increased from $260 to $650 million. Quid pro quos. Here's the summary of the 62 projects out of 88 for which there is evidence of bribe payments, either legal or the media or both. And we have all possible combinations of 3 of the main quid pro quos. Tailor-made auctions, favorable renegotiations, and extortion. So there's many things to look at this. First, as already is apparent from the examples I gave you, you can have more than one. You can pay bribes at different stages. Second, the business sector often complains that they're innocent because they're forced by extortions. At least in the case of Odebrecht, it's not a great argument. There's only evidence of 9 projects where this was a motive for bribing. That's 15%. It's not 0, but it's less than most people expected it to be. Tailored auction is a standard in the literature for decades. It's not surprising then that 46 out of 62 have that. The big surprise here is renegotiations. To our knowledge, there was no systematic evidence of renegotiations being associated with bribes, and this emerges for the first time in this work. There was evidence of renegotiations being important in public-private partnerships, this one way of providing infrastructure, which became important in the world over the last 3 decades. There's a crucial monograph by José Luis Guasch looking at over 1,000 contracts in Latin America when this new mode became popular in the 90s and showing that renegotiations were pervasive. But renegotiations can happen without there being any bribes or any corruption involved, and Guasch does not provide that evidence. And on public procurement, possibly because there's less good data, we don't have systematic evidence of renegotiations either. On the relation with corruption, again, anecdotes or correlations, like, for example, countries which have worse corruption indicators renegotiate more, but not anything concrete as to the magnitude involved, okay? Next, before I show you some great numbers, why should we care about renegotiations? So the standard Econ 101, if you don't take Wendy Collins' courses at least, about basically renegotiation is that it doesn't matter. Raquel owns a company, I own another company, we're both going to compete. We both know that after winning, we'll renegotiate and obtain a 20% extra money. We both bid more aggressively, we anticipate rents nonetheless, and from an allocative point of view, nothing has changed. So why then is that not the case? Why do we strongly believe in negotiations, even though often unavoidable because these are long-term contracts, when they're opportunistic and really damage society? One is the adverse selection problem. If Raquel, being much nicer than I am, is much better at renegotiating, she might get much more than I will. And then even though I might be more efficient, she might win nonetheless. So that's a major issue. Countries that renegotiate more are going to tend to attract firms that are relatively better at renegotiating and not necessarily very good on the technical side. It's not by chance that US companies are not present in the concession business in Latin America. They have more constraints on being creative when they renegotiate. The second is the moral hazard problem. Government officials are going to put in less effort in designing these contracts, which takes a lot of time to do a good job, if they know that their errors can be renegotiated away. And then there's some conjectures, even though little evidence by now at least, that this might be intentional, that they want to create sort of ill-defined contracts and poorly designed contracts so that you foster renegotiations. And finally, you have bailouts. Renegotiations are often you bail out a firm that is on the way to bankruptcy. And that, not only in Latin America, in the case of the UK, where the public-private partnership program is called the Public Finance Initiative, it was never able to recuperate politically after a major bailout of the London Underground PPP, basically. And this was a major renegotiation. There's no evidence, as far as I know, corruption, but there's evidence that the public just after that never favored PPPs or PFI again. So, here's a table with numbers which were not present before. Sure, it's the Odebrecht case. It's not all of infrastructure, but it's 88 projects, and you add 105 projects from Brazil, and the main idea remains there as well. We're going to look at projects which there's no bribe payments, and projects where you have bribes. And the definition of bribe can be two. It can be only legal documents or legal and media. And then you can take a simple average or a weighted average. So in total, 4 possible numbers. The 4 numbers, the 4 possibilities give you very similar messages. So it's not dependent on that. But let me tell you why I will prefer both legal and media. In some countries where the legal system works relatively well, Odebrecht was investigated. Peru, for example. Even Brazil, a lot happened on the legal side. In other countries, Mexico and Argentina, despite the fact that the DOJ had evidence which would be an excellent way of starting a trial in your country, there was no investigation whatsoever. So if you combine this with media, you get closer, I believe, to the truth. And you see the following 2 numbers, which are in red, if you can see them from where you are. Initially, it cost 100. Because infrastructure is difficult, hard, things happen you did not expect, the cost went up by 6% in the case of projects with no corruption. That seems reasonable. In contrast, in the case of projects with evidence of bribe payment, the increase was by 70%. With my co-authors, we've been looking for this for 20 years in our work in PPPs, not in infrastructure in general. This is now infrastructure in general. There's both types of projects. We expected it to be larger, but never 10 times or more as it turned out to be. Let's use the same data to look at the magnitude of bribes and the profits you make from bribes. Again, you can measure this in 3 ways. You can include only legal sources, and media, and then also what denominator do you take? You take all projects or the projects where you paid bribes. Both of them have arguments in their favor and against. No matter what you do, bribes as a fraction of final cost was less than 1%. The numbers are huge. I mean, Odebrecht, I'm going to tell you this in a minute, sold over $200 billion in a decade. But it's 1% of that was paid in bribes, and even a bit less, no matter how you calculate. So that's the estimate that comes out from here. This is something you must say very carefully when you talk to a journalist, because it's not that corruption is not important. It's definitely important, and people hate it, and for the right reason, in my opinion. But these numbers are much, much smaller. And if you want to think about policies, about understanding the phenomenon to come up with policies that work, it is an important number, even it might be surprising to you. So the numbers I gave you at the beginning of 5 to 30% of construction costs, here it's 1%. Is Odebrecht that special, or are those numbers not so careful? Is up for you to decide. The other column, you have profits from bribes. Again, depends on how you calculate it, but the number you could take away from here is 2%. So what you made as a fraction of sales was 2% thanks to the bribes you paid. Now, 2% can still be a lot of money. How do we gauge its magnitude and relevance? Well, we looked at Odebrecht's numbers. It's not that easy because it's a family-owned company, so it's not like just going to the web. But we came up with reasonably good estimates for its profits over this period, and it is $2.4 billion. The profits from bribe are very similar. Now, I'm not going to make the point that those two numbers are identical. They're not. There's a number of things why a family-owned company could, I'm sure they financed Mr. Odebrecht's airplanes and his lifestyle from the company and not from income, and there was some tunneling and the like. But there's evidence that the orders of magnitude are similar, and let me give you 2 pieces of evidence that point in that direction. First of all, the Department of Justice initially charged Odebrecht with a much larger fine, $4.5 billion. And Odebrecht managed to convince him that, yes, they don't have that money. And then they reduced the bribe to $3 billion. Second, you have Forbes, which dedicates most of its time to finding out how much money the rich have. And the Odebrecht family, which is on Forbes, or was on Forbes at least at the time, had wealth in the range of $4 to $6 billion. So these numbers suggest you should not take the twice 2.5 as being equal, but that they are in the same ballpark is a reasonable assumption. Now let's go to understand why Odebrecht did so well. I mean, most likely, and there's evidence which came out a bit later, that other firms were also bribing. It's not that Odebrecht was the only one bribing. This is a sector where it's usual that you bribe. In the case of Argentina, you had that the whole construction lobby representative, the Association of Construction Firms, was in cahoots with the government for decades and just negotiated how much the bribes would be. So from the Department of Justice, you have the following story emerge also from press reports, but the Department of Justice is an official document carefully done. Odebrecht created the Division of Structured Operations. This was 7 people, 3 executives, 4 assistants, full-time dedicated to paying bribes. It was a division within the company that specialized in bribe payments. Bribes above a certain threshold needed to be approved by Marcelo Odebrecht himself. Now, why is that relevant? Because it provides a competitive advantage. The standard in Latin America before Odebrecht was suitcases with money in the suitcase. That is a very inefficient way of paying bribes for at least 2 reasons. First, money gets lost from the moment you fill the suitcase till it arrives at the bribee. And there's a lot of evidence of how this leakage happens on the way. Second, the bribee faces a major problem. You must hide the money somewhere. In the case of Argentina, again, there's a wonderful episode where a government minister or undersecretary, the police comes to get him. He had money hidden in his home, under the mattress, let's say, and is told that the police is on its way. So he escapes his home with a suitcase full of money, runs to a convent a couple of blocks away, and is seen on the security cameras throwing in the suitcase, which is received by a nun, and so as to hide it. This was on the news in Argentina some years ago. So having in mind possibly situations like that, Odebrecht thought about his clients and decided to buy some subsidiaries of European banks in tax havens so that you could deposit the money there, far away from any tax authority in your country, and they hoped at the time at least able to hide it very well. So basically they have the statement from the DOJ. Odebrecht innovated in the bribe payment business and became much more efficient so that it needed to pay less bribes to obtain the same from the bribee. Here are the numbers. So the red line is profits, the blue line is sales. You see 2006 and sales in Odebrecht just go up. This is the quintupling multiplied by 5 the amount of sales of Odebrecht. Yet profits did not increase significantly. They remained pretty flat and not very large. So we provide a simple model. I'm not going to go into the details. I will just brush you through it. It's quite standard. So either you don't like models, or if you like them, you will know exactly what we're doing. The only thing it has is it provides an estimate of an order of magnitude. It's again not a precise estimate of the advantage which Odebrecht had, which is consistent with available data, basically. So some facts lead to assumptions. The fact that we have small profits and large negotiations, that there's a lot of lowballing, means that firms anticipate they're going to renegotiate. So that's going to be part of the model. We will also not model the fact that bribes are small. That's one of the open questions in our opinion, and the evidence we have from the Odebrecht case does not help us to move forward in that dimension. Some facts are explained by the model. One of them is the connection between bribes, lowballing, and renegotiations. And the second one is why the creation of DSO led to Odebrecht increasing its market participation 5-fold, but at the same time not increasing profits by much. And finally, the model provides a bound for Odebrecht's advantage. We get a value of this gamma parameter of 70%, which essentially means Odebrecht needs to pay $3 million, where other firms pay $10 million to obtain the same benefit from a bribe. The project, how are we with time, Raquel? Yes. So the project has a value W. Firms are characterized by 2 parameters, theta and rho. Theta is its cost parameter, which will be drawn from a distribution, and rho is its ability to renegotiate. The closer to 1 you get, the fraction you get of the surplus that's on the table when you renegotiate. Corruption, nature picks a type of public official. X is given as a fraction of surplus that is appropriated, and what you buy with a bribe is the larger value of this fraction you will get of the surplus that's up for grabs when you renegotiate. For simplicity, all the expressions are for a second price auction. Look at this game tree on the left side. Essentially, you have drawn a public official who is corrupt. You have a second auction. Your bid is R. You renegotiate the value of the project minus R, and then you have the payoffs, which are going to be for the firm, for society, and for the corrupt official. You go through the condition. Since it's a second price auction, you can just have the 0 profit condition, and from there you obtain your bid. The winning bid is R in that red rectangle. I'm not assuming you follow the details, but what is crucial is that R is your cost theta minus something positive. So you lowball. You, in anticipation of being able to renegotiate, your initial bid is under cost. It's not that you don't calculate your cost correctly, it's that you expect to renegotiate. And then you look at the parameters that determine the magnitude of lowballing, and you get the following result. You will lowball a lot, which is what we observe, when you have a combination of large rho, so you're good at renegotiating, small x, bribes are small, and large W minus theta, there's a lot for grabs, up for grabs when you negotiate. On the other hand, a large x, large bribes don't lead to the sort of data we observe. A second result, which is quite obvious, so I'll just tell you the result. The fact that you have this industrial organization might mean for many parameter configurations that if you don't bribe, you cannot compete. So you need to bribe in equilibrium. The third one is, again, relatively obvious. Before the DSO was created, before Odebrecht has this major advantage in bribing, we assume there are two firms, Odebrecht and a competitor. They're identical ex ante. They draw this data from a common distribution, IID draws. And of course, each one wins half of the time. It's sort of obvious. And profits are relatively small. I mean, profits are going to depend on the variance of the distribution. If the variance is small, your profits are small. If the variance is large, then you have a disadvantage because when you get a good theta, the other guy probably has a bad theta, and you have something to look forward to. And now comes the interesting part, which is we look at what happens if Odebrecht has an advantage so that it needs to pay less to obtain the same benefits from a bribe. This parameter gamma playing a crucial role. We do the algebra. The model is very simple and elegant, so you can do it. And of course, Odebrecht can win even if its cost is higher because it's better at paying bribes. It's more efficient if that cost is lower. A small advantage in X can lead to winning contracts. So we have, first of all, expressions for the probability of winning and for your expected profits. And there's basically what you have with two firms. The green line is before Odebrecht became a bribe innovator. Your probability is 0.5. On the x-axis, you have a measure of the variance of this shock. It's coefficient of variation. But then the moment you have this small advantage, small because gamma might be large, but bribes are relatively small. So the small is on the bribe side. No? And you see that the probability goes up to 1 if sigma is small and then comes down relatively slowly. Okay? On the other hand, the profits you make don't grow that much. Even though the math is different, intuitively, thinking of undergrads, which many of you are here, think of Bertrand competition with a minor cost advantage. With a minor cost advantage in Bertrand competition, you will win for sure, essentially, but your profits will be relatively small. And that's, in a more sophisticated version, what is happening in this model as well. And finally, we have the model provides an upper bound for rents, for bribes, that's an inequality, not an inequality, a closed form expression for bribes, and then you can obtain a bound for gamma, a lower bound. That bound is pretty precise when the sigma is small, when the variance of shocks is small, and that all brings us to this number of 0.7. Now, is it 0.6 or 0.8? Definitely could be a different number. When you equate this to the data we have, there's other reasons going on for bribes and the like. It just shows you a plausibility story and numbers that are reasonable. There's not data to do a really structural estimation, which is something we would have liked to do. Some policy implications. First, multilaterals, not the IMF, but the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and others, in the 90s and 2000s, pushed countries, developing countries, to have competitive tenders. The standard, also in China, was bilateral negotiations, which are, of course, much more open to shady business. And it helped. Despite the fact that we often criticize them a lot, it helped. What we're seeing here is that public officials are constrained by check and balances. Toledo cannot change an element of that auction. What we see here is that bribes exist but are relatively small. And what we're seeing here is that profits made by these firms are small. We looked at profits made by firms in other continents, and this is a sector which profits as a fraction of sales are quite small. And that's also in the case of developing countries, at least Latin America, at least where Odebrecht participated. On the other hand, What happens after the tender was completely forgotten. In developing countries, and may I say also in developed countries. I've not followed it more recently, but some years ago it was at a thesis defense at the Sorbonne, and in France at that time, you did not have any information on contract renegotiations whatsoever. So until the contract tendered was all on the web. After that, in principle, it might be somewhere hidden in some government office, but it was not easily available what would happen. So definitely, both for public-private partnerships and for traditional provision, you have a major problem with post-tender. You must need to put much more attention into what happens after a project is adjudicated. What are the reforms you should do? Here's a standard list from economics, where we don't claim to be original, but let me go through it. Maybe one of them is something which is not mentioned that much. First, publish all contract renegotiations. It sounds obvious, it's not. It is definitely not. In Chile, for concessions in 2006, a new minister decided to put them all on the web. Before that, none of it was on the web. And then when a new minister comes in public works, sometimes they hide them for a couple of weeks, then a letter goes to the newspaper, then they reappear again. So this is something public officials don't like to see on the web. Second, competitive tenders for any major new work you do. So if you want to do an initial highway in the case of Colombia, you need a new tender. That can be part of the law. Third, an independent panel that looks at significant renegotiations and must say this is okay and nothing strange is happening here. In the concession sector, in the PPP business, so this is part of infrastructure, not all of it, Chile in 2010 reformed its PPP law, including these three elements. Okay? Let's see what happened. And this is definitely not an RCT. So it's just suggestive, it's not causal, but let me give you numbers nonetheless. So first question, what do you compare? The longer a contract, the more opportunities to renegotiate. This was in the PPP sector. These are 30-year contracts, so you cannot compare the old projects with the new projects. So we looked only at projects during the construction phase and how many renegotiations there were and the size, the cost increase associated with renegotiation. So we are comparing, the comparison is fair. It's during the construction phase. All of these projects are finished, so construction is over. And we have two columns there. One is for highways only, other one is for the entire transport sector, where the main addition is airports. And we see that before the law of 2010, so this is from the mid-90s to 2010, project renegotiations was 26%. In Colombia, it was 100%. In Colombia, for the same period, it was for every dollar you had as initial cost, you added an additional dollar during the concession. Chile, 26%. If you look at all the transport sector, a little higher, 28%. It went down to 0.7%. So this went down enormously after. When the law was passed, the construction lobby and the concession lobby complained bitterly against renegotiation. In fact, what made possible the political cloud to have a reform was a very scandalous renegotiation in the mid-2000s, which forced the political, forced Congress to legislate on this. There was a lot of lobbying from the concession company. They watered down some of the measures, but enough measures were passed, and then institutions were built around this to reduce renegotiations significantly. Conclusion, a couple of open questions, and this could go on forever, so I'll mention just a few. First, I already mentioned it, what determines the relatively small magnitude of bribes? There's many stories and many conjectures, but we need the data to tell you which ones are likely and which ones are unlikely, and that's an area where you need a lot of more work to be done, and it's really an open question as far as I can tell. Second, what determines the impact of corruption on the public perception? There's a recent paper showing that people don't care if you pay a bribe of $1 million, 10 million, 100 million, that's not different. And I think that's true. I think people have a hard time with a lot of zeros and numbers. So what are the implications of that for policies against corruption and policies in infrastructure? It's a hard question. Then, check and balances on corrupt officials. Again, the Toledo story is good because it means that when you think about dealing with corruption, you want to have whistleblowers, you want to have the possibility of anonymous complaints and the like, and then protection for people who make these complaints. You need to think the infrastructure in a way that someone can say no when he or she receives pressure from the president to do something or from some high official. Finally, the interaction between politics and infrastructure is crucial, and it's not been part of this talk, but it has been part of other work I've been involved in as well. It is crucial because politicians, most of these scandals have behind them at least partly financing of political campaigns. That connection, we have a lot of stories, a lot of connections, not great theories. There's a book to be published by Alicia Holland from Harvard School of Government, which is very interesting, looking at the politics behind this. Again, more work needs to be done. And finally, part of the big problem here is the lack of data. I've spent half this talk or more talking about data, because without data, we have great conjectures. An anecdote is better than nothing. One case is better than nothing. But when we think about a systemic solution, it's important to gauge also the relative importance of what's going on. Summary then, the facts that emerged from the Odebrecht case: bribes were small relative to sales. Profits from bribes were also small relative to sales. Bribes less than 1%, profits around 2%. Conditional on paying a bribe, what you are buying, in part at least, is a much more generous renegotiation. Costs will increase by 70% if you paid bribes, only by 5 or 6% if you did not. And then in the Odebrecht story, Odebrecht innovated in how you paid bribes, and that, at least we argue, is part of why its sales quintupled in a short period of time. Policy implications: competitive tendering is important, keep it up. It was a good idea, don't scoff down on it. Second, put a lot of emphasis on what happens after those competitive tenders. And that's it, thanks a lot. I look forward to any questions.
Okay, we have time for a few questions, and I'm going to abuse my role as a moderator to ask the first question. And this might be a simple misunderstanding of how you're measuring profits from bribes. But the profits, if you're looking at as a share of profits, how much is coming from bribes? Is that small? That's the one thing I didn't understand. Or are you just looking at it as a share of revenue, as sales, as a share of sales? If it's a share, as a share of profits is large, then that's what we care about, not as a fraction of sales. And if it's small as a fraction of profits, why don't they do something more profitable with their money rather than take this, ex post at least, rather large risk of being investigated and thrown in jail, et cetera? So we'll start there.
Yeah, let's start there. So first, the second part of your comment is a great comment. There's a wonderful book by a Brazilian journalist of 1,000 pages on the Odebrecht case, and they thought the probability of going to jail was 0. So that's, and it's definitely, I think that's part of this, is that suddenly things change. In the case of Brazil, we know what happened, 2014, the World Cup, law changed, and you could have plea bargains, and it changed the whole dynamics, but they did not expect it. But your first question is great, because I might have misspoken. The numbers are the following ones. Odebrecht overall profits during these 10 years, $2.4 billion. Of those, profits from bribe equal 2.4. So the total was only bribes if you take the numbers without any measurement error. So without bribes, Odebrecht would have made $0. They made money thanks to the fact that they bribed. Now, these numbers are not totally precise. I was quite clear about that at least, but that's the number. So it's very surprising. I mean, we expected it to be very different.
Let me open it up to questions now, and if I don't see you, just scream. Yeah. Maybe say who you are when you're asking a question.
Hi, I'm David Castells from Autonomous University of Barcelona. Thanks for the talk. Just as a matter of curiosity from my ignorance. So you said that at the end, Odebrecht was fined, I don't remember the number, by the US court, or if I got it right. Who kept that money? The US, or what happened with that?
The money was divided between Brazil, the US, and Switzerland. I don't remember the percentages, but you can look it up in the documents. So the US DOJ sets this fine. The US has an institutionality to do this, which is really great. And I mean, FIFA, the FIFA corruption scandal was followed by the US as well, even though FIFA was in Switzerland. So any corrupt official, money must go at some moment through the US banking system. That is enough for the US to have the right to intervene. And they do, compared to most other countries, a much better job.
Isn't that like a second
in the case
round
of this plea bargain, it represented 3 countries, Switzerland, the US, and Brazil.
But isn't that like a second round of international corruption then? Like, shouldn't that money have gone to the affected countries?
Let me put it this way. Nothing precludes the affected countries of running their own trials, and Brazil did, to some extent. And many other countries did as well. Peru also did, while other countries did nothing about this. So this is speculation, but I would not be surprised that the US invited other countries to participate in Latin America, and for some reason they might not have been totally interested in being part of the case.
Next, yeah.
This is Martin from EAFIT. Do you have any, because I didn't catch that very well, any theory on why profits didn't go up as sales went up? It's so strange because profits are anything but spectacular or impressive. Is that part of like a bigger corruption scheme where they take the money out, or is that a race to the bottom between companies? Do you have like any theory on why that is the case?
Well, the model I show you is basically tries to explain why Odebrecht sales increased so much and profits increased little. It's basically that you had a competitive advantage, but that advantage was still relatively small and you still had competitors around you. There's one case which I don't go on into in the presentation, but there's a case where Odebrecht paying a bribe even though it would win without the bribe, essentially. It still knows it has the best points, but it's just a very nervous participant and pays for that bribe. So the margins were kept relatively small because of competitive tender, because of limiting the bids you can make, which are plausible, and the like, so it kept things relatively small. They did make money. $2.5 billion is not little. It's a sector where you don't make huge amounts of money. It's a sector which is pretty competitive. As economists, we should be focusing on maybe it's inefficient. Maybe there's another firm who should do the same, make the same amount of profits, but do it at a lower cost. But they made money, but it's a sector where the standard is that as a fraction of sales, your profits are small. This is not only the Odebrecht case, it's quite generally in this sector.
Danny?
A great presentation. 2 quick questions. One, you know, there's an interesting anomaly here, which the first part of your presentation highlighted, which is the big costs associated with the scandal itself, as in the Odebrecht case or in other big scandals. And those aren't what's sort of captured in your model. So the big thing is sort of the scandal breaks out, and then there are sort of, you know, a whole bunch of other, you know, sort of macro and other sort of political perceptions caused, and sort of that is the result of not the bribing itself, but actually the revelation of information about the uncovering of the scandal, which is sort of different. Now, if you thought that everybody knew that there's a lot of corruption going on, the information itself, or the revelation that there was corruption going on, should not have moved things a lot. So it should not have mattered. On the other hand, if there was new information, then there's the kind of maybe a little bit of a, you know, maybe cynical or paradoxical implication that maybe not uncovering this information might have been better, because the costs are, you know, sort of, it seems to have been very large if you take the IMF, you know, growth assumptions about what they were and so forth. So how do we think about that? Because it's really, a big part of the cost seems to be sort of scandal-related costs rather than bribery itself. Maybe it's the other thing is, on a lot of the empirical work on corruption, sort of with public procurement or tenders, the work is really about looking at comparing contracts where firms that were politically connected won, or there was, you know, some of the contracting features were manipulated, so there was only one firm. and then comparing contract costs in those cases versus those others, holding fixed a bunch of observables. And those tend to find that the contract costs, when there was presumed corruption, were higher compared to the other cases, whereas your main point is really that taking into account renegotiation costs, where there is corruption, in fact, the bids should come in lower rather than higher. So how do we think about that literature in light of or those findings in light of your contribution?
So let me begin with the second question. Basically, with you have the problem with infrastructure projects is that they're much more unique. So you cannot have those comparisons easily with infrastructure because you have no obvious standard. So you can have politically connected or not connected, but there's no clear benchmark as to how you compare the cost of projects. It's not as having per kilometer cost or something like that in a highway or something like that. It's really every project is unique, which makes this very difficult. So I remember a quote from a conference with Larry Summers some years ago, where he said, basically, that originating the cost of large infrastructure projects is much larger than what you think you can explain with observables. But you don't know more than that. It's not that you have something simple. With other type of contracts, we have a standard you can then look at, compare cost with and without political connection. The second question you asked is, I've thought about that a lot. So the cynical view would be the best for society is we don't find out about this. I think that summarizes your point. Maybe in the short run, yes, but maybe in the medium run, if this does not happen, people who are corrupt become more and more and more ambitious, and eventually they are found. So that was one element. My usual answer to that question is a different one. Too late. We're in a world where you're not going to put back the genie in the bottle. People are going to find this out. As you suggested, essentially what happens with this case is even though people suspected that Odebrecht was in shady business, they did not know the magnitude, the involvement of all sorts of officials and business people, and at the local level, the national level. When this becomes, and nowadays where you have details of the conversations they had, the emails they had, the phone conversations they have, for the public, it becomes much, much more than just the idea that maybe there's a bit of illegal money out there. It becomes very clear, and it's also telling you, look, these roads, etc., for me, there's corruption involved. And then there's an issue which I did highlight, and which is, even though the percentages are small, go explain that to the public. I mean, $1 billion is $1 billion, even if it's out of $200 billion or whatever. Those numbers are not easy to grasp for the public. And in this case, depending on your point of view, this might be positive or negative, but it's definitely a fact to consider.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question. Yes.
Hi, Juan Panicolini from Minneapolis, Fed and Ditela. The question is going to be quick. So the numbers you have are the numbers from the DOJ. So this is basically what comes out of what they could find. Should we think of them as as a lower bound on how large the bribes are? I mean, bribes are about to be, precisely what you do is hiding everything you do. So the notion that you can come up to the true number after a trial seems at least suspicious. Do you have any reaction to that?
Oh, okay. Okay, so sorry, the acoustic is not great. It's great, but not with you. So basically, the question, if I understood correctly, thanks to Raquel, is why we trust the numbers from the DOJ, right? Okay? Yeah. If you go to the DOJ and read the first page, it says very clearly, if any of these numbers is wrong and was given in bad faith, so knowingly wrong, then the plea bargain is really crucial. Depending on who's involved, it makes the difference between going to jail and not going to jail, or going to jail many years and going to jail a few years, or the difference between a much larger and a much smaller fine. There's a lot of stake for those who sign these plea bargains. And if the DOJ, which has a big team of people specialized on this, finds that you knowingly lied, then the plea bargain is over and they start from zero again, and they can use all the evidence you gave against you. So during a plea bargain, you're told, you know what? You give me all the evidence and I will not do more than this to you. So you have all the incentives in the world to say everything. But should you lie, that evidence will be used against you and will get you possibly much, much more than you would have ever gotten had you not gone to a plea bargain. So that's the way not Latin American judicial systems work, where we have very little of that and we're, I think, very ineffective. But that's the way well-functioning Anglo-Saxon systems work with common law, and that's why this, I think, is crucial. I mean, believe me when I say it's correct, but reading it is different from hearing it from me. Google DOJ Odebrecht, and you will see the 70-page, read the first 5 pages, and you will be sure that Mr. Odebrecht, when he signed that, he was really careful about having all the information there. He knew about it. And you go through it and say, we have 12 public officials. They don't say their name, but DOJ has the name. And public official number 7 was approached by on this date, was given this amount of money in this event, etc. It's really a specialized institution on how to deal with corruption cases in a credible way, because in any legal system, to put someone in jail, you must have a good case. You cannot have a case where it's only likely that you're right. It must be beyond reasonable doubt. And to do that, you must have a very well-working judicial system for these cases. And the FCPA, which the US was way ahead of Europe, is, for world standards, working well.
Okay, I think that Eduardo has given us all reading material for tonight, and I expect all of us to Google DOJ's Odebrecht case, and I know I will. I want to thank Eduardo very much and to thank the audience for their participation.